Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be covering an extremely powerful tool that most users don't even realize they have, Power Pivot. If you work with large data sets or struggle with complex pivot tables, Power Pivot can completely change the way you analyze your data. In this video, I'll break down what Power Pivot is, when and why to use it, how it works, and I'll also walk you through the basics so you can start to use it straight away. Power Pivot is a data modeling and calculation engine built straight into Excel. It lets you build relationships between different tables, work with massive data sets across multiple sources, create advanced calculations using DAX language, data analysis expressions, supercharge pivot tables with more flexibility and speed. You can think of Power Pivot as Excel's version of a database, only it's fully integrated and easier to use. How Power Pivot works. Power Pivot works by storing your data in what's called the data model. You load your data into the data model from various sources, such as Excel, Power Pivot, SQL. Once the data is in the data model, you define relationships between the multiple tables. You then can create calculated columns or DAX measures. And finally, you can build pivot tables or pivot charts off that data model. It's like building a mini database within Excel, but with the same interface that you're already comfortable with. Are you ready to have a go? Let's walk through a basic Power Pivot demo. To use Power Pivot, you need to have the COM add-in enabled. If you can't see Power Pivot up in your ribbon, then the first step is to go to File, Options, Add-ins, Manage COM add-ins, click Go, tick Power Pivot for Excel. Click OK. We can now see Power Pivot within the ribbon. Now that we have Power Pivot enabled, we need to add our data to the data model. For this particular example, I've got 4 sets of data on these tabs within my workbook. I've got team information, players information, matches information, and player stats. There's 2 routes in how we can get these tables into the data model from within Excel. The first is we can go directly from an Excel table into the data model. To do that, you would go to the Power Pivot ribbon, select anywhere within your data, and click Add to Data Model. This is going to load up the data model. However, first your data must be in a table, so you can see Excel's prompting for that here. I'm going to click OK. So now we can see that table is within the data model. However, for more flexibility and to allow for data manipulation before the data enters the data model, then I would recommend that you take your data from Excel or an external source into Power Query for the data manipulation element, and then export it from Power Query into the data model. That way you can do any manipulation of the data in Power Query, which is the native Microsoft solution for that, and then we can do the further analysis with pivot tables and pivot charts in Power Pivot. So I'm just going to delete this table from the data model, and instead I'm going to give this a name, Teams. To add this to Power Query, now we've given the table a useful name, we're going to go to Data, from Table and Range. That's going to load up the Power Query editor. Our table's now within Power Query. We can do any manipulation at this point. For this particular example, I'm just going to close and load to. We're going to create a connection only. So this particular table is not going to output into our current workbook as a table, a pivot table report, or a pivot chart. We're simply going to hold the query connection within Power Query. But most importantly, we're now going to click this tick box which says add this data to the data model. That's going to move the data from Power Query and into the data model so we can work with it for Power Pivot. Okay, so now if we were to go to Data, Data Model, Manage Data Model, or Power Pivot, Manage Data Model, or I have it up in my Quick Access toolbar. So this is the data model. You can see at the bottom, similar to Excel, we've got table names. At the moment we only have 1 for the Teams table that we've added. You can then see the actual table data that we've added. We have a traditional formula bar, very much like Excel, and a ribbon across the top. So at this point, I'm just going to close the data model and we're going to finish adding in our 3 other tables. I'm going to skip forward through that because the concept is exactly the same as what we've just done with that table. A little tip for you, if whilst you're adding your data into Power Query and forget to add it to the data model in your load to settings, you can amend this later without recreating the query. So to illustrate this, I'm not going to take out this data to the data model. I'm going to click OK. If we go into the data model, you'll see at the moment we only have 3 tables, not that final table we've just loaded into Power Query for the player stats. So we're going to right click on the query. To see this pane that I'm using on the side, it would be data, your queries and connection pane. Right click on the particular query, load to, and then you can see we now have the option to add this data to the data model. Click OK. So we now have these 4 tables added into Power Query and then also loaded to the data model, like so. The next step is to establish our relationships between these 4 tables. So to do this, we're going to go into the diagram view. At the moment you can see we're on the data view, which shows us our table data. Diagram view is up here. Now we have all 4 tables in a diagram view. You can make these tables bigger by dragging. You can also move them around so that you can better position to create your relationships. And then to create a relationship between a table, what we can do is we can click on a common field between each. So for example, I could go from the team ID in the teams table to the team ID in the players table, and that's established a relationship for us. Note the 1 here and the star here indicates that we have a one-to-many relationship. The 1 representing the fact that within our teams table we have unique team IDs where this only appears once, and then in the many we've got multiple players who could potentially have the same team ID. So that's the asterisk or the many side of the relationship. This is the only native relationship you can create in this diagram view. You can't do bi-directional like you can within Power BI. However, what we can do later is I'll give an example of how we can use DAX calculations to travel the opposite direction through these relationships. So I'm just going to continue building some relationships between these tables. We could go from the players table to the player stat table using the player IDs. And then we could go from this player stats table to the matches table using the match IDs. So you can see here we've got 3 relationships established between the 4 tables. These relationships have been built without any crossing over here, but you can see here, for example, it starts to get a little bit messy when lines are crossing over each other. So you probably want to think about how these can best be placed on the diagram view so that it's nice and simple to follow through what's going on. To double check what relationships are being used here, you can hover over the relationship arrows and then it highlights which fields within the 2 tables are being used. So for here you can see the match ID, player ID and the team ID. Now at this point we can output a simple pivot table by going to the pivot table option here, and you can see we've got all these inbuilt options. I'm just going to click pivot table for now. It's going to ask us where to put it. I'm going to place it on the summary sheet. Now on the right hand side, because we used Power Pivot to pass this data into the data model, you can see we've got the original data tables here without this little orange symbol by them, and then these duplicated tables up here with the little orange symbol here. This indicates that these are within Power Pivot, and if you hover over the table names you can see that shows the data source is the T matches within the matches sheet, and it shows the cell range. Whereas if we hover over that same table with the orange symbol, you can see this source is the data source query. So we need to make sure we're working with these Power Query tables. And for this example, I'm just going to expand these out so we can see the fields. We're going to pull in the teams into our rows, and then we're going to pull in the players into our rows, and then we're going to show how many goals each of those players scored. So now we have a grand total of 9 goals across these players for these teams. So if we go into the player stats table, if we add a total row into our table by going to table design, total row, we'll add a total of the goals. You can see this is the 9 we were expecting. And if we were to sense check one, so we've got player ID of 102. If we go into the players table, that 102 is Erling Haaland. Erling Haaland plays for team ID 2. So if we go into the teams table, team ID 2 is Manchester City. So in our pivot table, we should be expecting Erling Haaland plays for Man City and scored 2 goals. And there we have it, a pivot table with 4 separate tables with the relationships created instead of creating one master table with all our data using lookups or table mergers. And just to fully utilize these 4 tables, we could use something from the matches table. So we could pull in possibly the date that these goals happened for Erling Haaland. I'm going to pop them in my columns. I'm going to get rid of this date aggregation, and now we can see that on the particular example we were looking at for Erling Haaland, he scored 2 goals on the 21st of April. And if we go into the player stats table, the 2 goals we were looking for Erling Haaland were in match ID 201. So if we go into the matches table, match ID 201 took place on the 21st of April. DAX measures allow you to create calculations to display data that might not necessarily be in your source data. I'm going to give an example of how we could calculate total goals and assists, even though our data only shows goals or assists. So in the pivot table, within our player stats table, I'm just going to add in the assists so that we can see them. These don't actually have to be shown within the pivot table for this to work. And then we're going to go to our measures where we can write our DAX calculations. If you go to manage measures, you'll see any existing measures and you can edit them, delete them, or create new ones. However, we don't have any at the moment. I'm just going to click new, or we could have gone measures, new measure. And then I'm going to write in here a measure name. I'm going to call this total goals and assists. So we need to be mindful of which table we're creating this measure in. So I'm going to create this within the player stats table because that's where my goals and assists are currently held. And then we're going to use a sum of the goals, and you can see this auto prompt shows us the available fields. So I'm going to go and do a sum within the player stats table, the goals field. We can just click on that or use the arrow buttons to go up and down and press tab, close our parenthesis, plus sum, and we're going to do the same for the assists. You can check your formula at any time by clicking check formula here. You can see we have no errors in this formula, and you can also format the pivot table field. I'm going to set this as a number, no decimal places. Now you can see our new field is pre-populated in, and you'll also see we have this little FX denoting a measure for total goals and assists sat within our player stats table here that's automatically added itself as a values field. We just sense check this. We can see that Mo Salah, 3 goals, 1 assist, and now we can see the combined total of 4 in our newly created measure. These measures are contextual, so as this pivot table is being calculated, the DAX calculation is happening on the fly in the background for only the data displayed within the table. So for example, if we were only interested in Bukayo Saka's data, the only calculations going on would be for Bukayo Saka. This makes these contextual measures really efficient. However, within the data model, if we go into manage, there is the option for calculated fields. So within the player stats table, and we can add a column. We can go equals, goals, and assists. You can see that's added a calculated column that's adding up each of these values to a total. We can name that column just like in Excel. We could call it total G&A. And then within our pivot table, if we close the data model, we'd have that calculated column as an option to add in. The only difference between these two methods is by adding a calculated column into our data model, we've expanded our data set for every single row within that table. In this particular example, we've only got a handful of rows, so it doesn't matter. But if you imagine you could have a 1,000,000 row data model for this particular table, by adding that one simple calculated column, we've effectively added another 1,000,000 rows of data into it, whereas that contextual measure would only ever be showing that calculation for what your pivot table is currently showing. And in that example where I just had Bukayo Saka, we'd only have a much smaller data set. We take a look at this relationship where we've been looking at player names and the goals. We've been going from the players table and traveling along this relationship to the goals within the player stats table. Let's look at an example where we want to travel the opposite way. So we're going to pull data from the player stats table and try and retrieve data from the players table. For this example, I'm going to put the match ID in my rows and I'm going to pull the player names as a count. We can see here that for every single match ID, it's returned a total of 6 players. However, if we look at the player stats table, we know that for every single match ID, we only have 2 players. So we would expect this count to show 2. The problem here is we can't travel backwards along this relationship. A way around that is using a DAX calculation. We're going to do the DAX calculation slightly differently this time to illustrate that you don't need to use the measures and new measure option. You can actually build your measures directly within the data model using the data view. To do this, the syntax is slightly different. We're going to start by writing our measure name, player count. Then we're going to put colon, equals, and then we'll start typing our calculation. So for this, we're going to use calculate, and we're going to do a count of our player names from our players table, close parenthesis, and then we're going to create a filter by using a CROSSFILTER function, and our CROSSFILTER left column, so our relationship from one table column to another table column, and then which direction. So we're going to go from our players table using the players ID, and we're going to go to the player ID within our player stats table, and then we're going to set our direction as both, and we're going to close parenthesis on the CROSSFILTER and close parenthesis on the calculate. So if we hit enter now, you can see at the moment, because we have every single match available, there's a 6. However, if we add our new DAX measure as a count, you can see actually this time we've got the correct answer because that CROSSFILTER is allowing us to travel the opposite way through that relationship. To wrap up, Power Pivot gives Excel database level power right in your spreadsheet. It's ideal for large data sets, multi-table relationships, and advanced reporting. It uses DAX, a powerful formula language, to create scalable and dynamic calculations. And once you've built the model, it becomes reusable and refreshable all at the click of a button. If you're serious about reporting, Power Pivot is one of the most useful skills you can learn in Excel. Like this video if you've learned something new, and subscribe to more deep dives into the Power Pivot tool. Drop a comment if you want beginner level friendly DAX calculations or a full Power Pivot dashboard walkthrough. Thanks for watching.